It was a room of silver forks and stiff tuxedos, crystal chandeliers, glasses that clinked with soft laughter. This was the annual gala, the kind where everyone knew everyone, where money spoke in winks and silence. At the center, an easel, lit just so, a painting, a striking portrait in oil. A young man, eyes closed, mouth open, mid-area, lost in music. Tuxedo white, shadows blue, a single spotlight falling on his cheekbone like a stage light. A voice near the back said, "Ah, the unnamed tenor, anonymous but majestic." A tribute, another whispered. To art itself, someone else offered. And then a voice broke the comfort. Old, cracked like it hadn't been used in years. $200, it said. Heads turned. It came from row 9. A man stood, alone. He wore a wrinkled button-up shirt and a pair of slacks that had seen better decades. No cufflinks, no wine in hand. Just a folded auction paddle shaking slightly. People stared. Someone chuckled. Someone else whispered, "Is he lost?" And then came the voice everyone heard. "Sir, do you know what you're bidding on?" The old man looked at the painting, then back at them. He nodded. Slow, certain. "Yes," he said, "I know exactly who that is." A polite laugh rippled across the room. The auctioneer leaned into the mic. "Do you wish to place a bid, sir?" The man didn't sit down. He didn't flinch. "I do," he said. "That is me." For a moment the laughter stopped, like someone had unplugged the sound system. The man didn't smile, didn't explain. He just stood there, still as stone, eyes locked on the painting. And as silence hung in the chandeliered air, a quiet voice in the front whispered, "It can't be." But the man said nothing more. Not yet. He would let his voice speak for itself when the time came. He hadn't worn a tuxedo in over 40 years. Didn't own one anymore. Didn't need one either. Not after Vienna. Not after her. Back then, he had a name people whispered in velvet seats. Not a nickname. Not a title. A name sung in 5 languages, printed in golden programs, echoed in balconies long after the curtain fell. Samuel Renaud. They called him the Lantern, because his voice didn't just shine. It carried people through dark places. But that was before the final letter. Before the hospital room. Before he stood in a hallway outside her door, crumpling a contract for his last performance. He didn't tell the press. Didn't make a speech. He just left. One night, he was standing center stage in Paris. The next, he was boiling tea and reading aloud from Chekhov beside a woman with no hair and fading eyes. His wife Miriam, the only audience that ever mattered. And when she was gone, he packed away the scores, tucked the tuxedo into a box, closed the piano, and stopped singing, not out of pain, out of choice. He had nothing left to say. Not without her. The years passed like quiet notes. He worked in a library for a while. Then in a music shop tuning guitars he didn't understand. No one recognized him. He never corrected them, until last week. He'd seen the flyer by accident, folded between junk mail and a grocery circular. Annual Arts Charity Auction, featuring works inspired by forgotten voices of opera, and they're printed in black and white. Lot 43, the tenor in Light Artist Unknown. But he knew. He knew. He remembered the photographer, remembered the moment. A rehearsal in Naples. 1981. Someone had taken a photo just as he sang the final note of Una furtiva lagrima. His face tilted, eyes lost in sound. Miriam had been standing just off stage, hand over heart. He had never seen that image again, until now. Now it was hanging on velvet in a room full of people sipping 30-top cocktails. And they didn't know his name, didn't know the story, didn't know the sacrifice, but he was here. Not to win, not to prove, not to perform, just to stand before what was left of him and say quietly, "I remember," and maybe, just maybe, make sure the world remembered too. The auctioneer shifted in place, elegant, trained, used to selling sculpture, not silence. He tapped the microphone, smiled tightly. "We have 200 from the gentleman in row 9. He glanced at the spot, as if hoping it had been a mistake, but Samuel was still there, standing, still. Both hands wrapped around the paddle like a life preserver. A few people chuckled. Someone near the back murmured, "Is this part of the show?" The woman at table 4 turned to her husband and said too loudly, "I'm sure he thinks it's a print." Samuel didn't flinch. He just looked at the painting. The younger version of himself immortalized in a moment he never meant to keep. Eyes closed, mouth open, frozen mid-breath. 300, a sharp voice called, head swiveled. A man in a deep blue suit leaned back in his chair, smirking. "I'll bid 300 just to keep the old man honest." The room laughed. Not cruelly, not yet, but with that soft, dismissive tone reserved for the harmless and confused. 300, the auctioneer confirmed, voice easing with familiarity. He turned toward Samuel again. "Would you like to counter, sir?" Samuel lifted his chin. 325. The laugh was louder this time. A waiter glanced sideways. A woman whispered, "Should we tell him it's real oil?" Someone check if he wandered in from outside. Another said not even trying to hide it. But Samuel didn't move, didn't sit, didn't smile. Just looked at the man in the painting and whispered to himself, to no one, "You're all I have left." The auctioneer hesitated. He was used to charm, to pacing, to playful escalation. Not this. Not an old man in a cheap shirt staring at a painting like it might fall apart if he blinked. "Do I hear 400? He asked, almost reluctant. Another voice jumped in. "Why not 450? This time the laughter had teeth. And Samuel, he took one step forward. He placed his paddle down, folded his hands behind his back, and spoke without microphone, without invitation. "I'm not bidding," he said. Not really. People quieted just enough to hear him. "I just wanted to see it. One more time. And tell you." He looked around the room. Their gowns, their cufflinks, their careful amusement. Then back at the portrait. That man sang only once like that, because his wife was standing just off stage. She'd just been told she had 6 months to live. Now the room was quiet, but Samuel didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He just stepped closer to the easel, let the light touch his lined face, and softly added, "And she said, 'Sing it like I'm already gone.'" No one laughed after that. Silence. Heavy, uncomfortable, real. The kind that fills a room when laughter dies too fast and shame has nowhere to hide. Samuel stood just below the easel, back straight, chin lifted. His hands, now trembling slightly, moved to open a small, worn case he'd brought with him. It wasn't a violin, not a prop, just a sheet of paper. Folded, yellowed with time. He held it up, then lowered it again. "She asked me not to sing again," he said softly. "Not because she didn't love it, but because it hurt her too much. To see what it cost me to leave it behind." He paused. No one moved. Even the auctioneer stayed frozen, mouth parted, caught between the rules and the moment. "But tonight," he said, eyes finding the painting again, "I think she would understand." And then he sang. No accompaniment, no warm-up, no stage, just a man, his voice, and the echo of 40 years held inside his chest. It was only a phrase, maybe 8 bars, a passage from Nessun Dorma. Tender, controlled, filled with ache. It wasn't perfect, not youthful, not powerful, but it had truth. The kind of truth that silences silverware, that makes hearts stop mid-beat. And it did. Waiters stood still. Guests forgot their glasses. One woman lowered her phone mid-snap without realizing it, and when he reached the final word, Vincero, it didn't ring. It settled, like dust, like the soft closing of a music box that had waited far too long. The room didn't applaud, Not at first, because applause would have broken something. The silence itself was the standing ovation. And in that silence, every person in that room saw something different. Some saw the man in the painting. Some saw the woman who waited backstage. But most saw themselves, saw all the songs they never sang, the chances they let go, the people they forgot to remember. Finally, someone rose, a woman in black, hand trembling near her mouth. She stood, and then another, and another, until the whole room was standing. Not for the painting, not for the auction, not for nostalgia, but for a man who once walked off stage for love and had quietly, finally, come back. And this time the spotlight stayed. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Twice, not to speak, but to steady himself. Even his practiced voice had faltered. He looked down at his clipboard, forgot where he was in the bidding. It didn't matter anymore. The room was different now. Changed. Shifted. Still glowing from the final note. Then came a voice, firm, measured, unfamiliar. 5,000. Everyone turned. A man in a gray suit. Young. Clean lines. Face unreadable. Eyes fixed on the painting. The auctioneer blinked. 5,000, yes, the man said. For the man in the painting. You mean for the portrait? No. I mean what it stands for. Another hand went up. 7. This time from an older woman, eyes wet, chin lifted. 7,000, she said, to keep his story with us. The auctioneer stood straighter. Found his rhythm again. 7,000. Do I hear 8? Samuel said nothing. He simply returned to his seat. No dramatics, no bow. He placed the old sheet of music back in the case, closed it gently, and rested his hands in his lap. Someone whispered from behind. He could have made millions. Another replied. He did. Just not with money. The bidding continued. 10, 12, 15,000. But Samuel had tuned it out, because something else was happening. A woman across the aisle had turned to face him. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." A waiter passed by and stopped mid-step, bowed his head slightly. Even the blue-suited man who had mocked him earlier, he didn't bid again. Just sat still watching. The portrait finally sold at $21,000 to a foundation. They promised to display it publicly with the story beneath. A plaque, a name, a date, and a single line. He sang once more, and we remembered. Samuel never stood again that night. He didn't need to, because somewhere between the laugh that began it all and the silence that followed his song, he had already risen, not on a stage, but in their hearts. And in that moment, not one person in that gilded room saw him as the old man anymore. They saw him as something else, a legacy, a voice, and above all, a man who kept his final promise by singing for love one last time. The following morning, the world moved on, but his world didn't. Samuel woke in his quiet apartment. Same narrow window, same flickering kettle, same chair beside the radio that hadn't worked in years. He didn't check the news. Didn't know his name was now trending. Didn't know the video just 22 seconds of his song had gone viral overnight. Didn't know 1,000 comments now whispered. I cried, and I don't even know why. I felt like I knew that man. Why didn't we know him before? Samuel just boiled tea. Black, no sugar. Same as Miriam had made it. He sat in silence. Let it steep. Then the knock came. 3 gentle taps. Not urgent. Not official. He opened the door slowly. On the other side stood a young man in a deep navy suit. No tie. Holding an envelope. Mr. Renault, Samuel nodded, still unsure what the world wanted with him. My name is Thomas Vale. I'm with the New York Symphony Trust. He offered the envelope like it weighed more than it should. We'd like to honor you. Samuel blinked. Didn't move to take it. A gala. A night of remembrance. We'll feature the painting. But more than that, we want you to speak. To tell your story. Samuel looked down at the envelope. then back at the young man's eyes. They weren't ambitious. They weren't trying to use him. They were grateful, hopeful. "Why now?" Samuel asked. Because Thomas said quietly, "Someone finally listened. And we can't unhear it." Samuel didn't answer, not then. He simply took the envelope, closed the door gently, and walked back to the chair by the window. He stared at the kettle now cooling, and at the small sheet of paper still resting on the table. The aria, Miriam's favorite? He unfolded it, smoothed it out. And for the first time in decades, he began to hum. Soft, tentative, but certain. Outside, the city didn't know. But in one room with one man, a quiet rehearsal had begun. The invitation became real. 2 weeks later, he stood in the back hallway of Carnegie Hall. Not on stage near it. Behind the curtain, behind the noise. Samuel hadn't worn anything special. Just a dark blazer, his only one. Pressed shirt, worn shoes polished till they almost remembered being new. He didn't need anything more, because the room was already full. Not just of people, of stories, whispers, old names revived. He walked away from everything for love. He turned down Vienna for a hospital room. He sang just once and the world remembered. They hadn't rehearsed this. They didn't ask him to sing, just to stand, to be seen, to be honored. Inside the hall, the painting now hung on an easel at center stage, spotlit. Below it, a young soprano was preparing to sing the same aria he had once made famous. Nessun Dorma. The piece Miriam had whispered to him through a morphine haze. "Sing it like I'm already gone." Samuel waited in the wings. A staff member offered him a chair. He declined. His hands were calm now. The conductor gave the downbeat, and the soprano began. Her voice was strong, pure, clear as a church bell in winter. Samuel didn't measure her. He didn't compare. He just listened. When she reached the crescendo, she turned her body slightly, just enough to face him in the shadows. And she sang the last word directly to where he stood. Vincerò. His breath caught. Not from pride, from memory. He saw Miriam again. Not in pain. Not pale. Smiling eyes full backstage in Naples. The final note faded. And before the applause came, before the audience could even rise, someone in the front row did something simple. They turned to Samuel and stood. One by one the room followed. Not for the singer, not for the painting, but for the man who had once chosen love over legacy, and in doing so had created something deeper than fame. A man who never returned to the stage, but had never really left it. He stepped forward, just enough for the light to find him. Not center stage, not under spotlight, just enough. And he nodded, not for applause, but for the memory, for the music, for her. And in that moment, every soul in that room knew. Some arias never end. They just echo until someone is brave enough to sing them again. The invitation became real. 2 weeks later, he stood in the back hallway of Carnegie Hall. Not on stage near it, behind the curtain, behind the noise. Samuel hadn't worn anything special. Just a dark blazer. His only one. Pressed shirt. Worn shoes polished till they almost remembered being new. He didn't need anything more, because the room was already full. Not just of people, of stories, whispers, old names revived. He walked away from everything for love. He turned down Vienna for a hospital room. He sang just once and the world remembered. They hadn't rehearsed this. They didn't ask him to sing, just to stand, to be seen, to be honored. Inside the hall, the painting now hung on an easel at center stage. Spotlit. Below it, a young soprano was preparing to sing the same aria he had once made famous. Nessun Dorma. The piece Miriam had whispered to him through a morphine haze. "Sing it like I'm already gone." Samuel waited in the wings. A staff member offered him a chair. He declined. His hands were calm now. The conductor gave the downbeat, and the soprano began. Her voice was strong, pure, clear as a church bell in winter. Samuel didn't measure her. He didn't compare. He just listened. When she reached the crescendo, She turned her body slightly just enough to face him in the shadows, and she sang the last word directly to where he stood. Vincerò. His breath caught, not from pride, from memory. He saw Miriam again, not in pain, not pale, smiling eyes full backstage in Naples. The final note faded, and before the applause came, before the audience could even rise, someone in the front row did something simple. They turned to Samuel and stood. One by one the room followed, not for the singer, not for the painting, but for the man who had once chosen love over legacy, and in doing so had created something deeper than fame. A man who never returned to the stage but had never really left it. He stepped forward, just enough for the light to find him. Not center stage, not under spotlight, just enough, and he nodded, not for applause, but for the memory, for the music, for her. And in that moment, every soul in that room knew. Some arias never end. They just echo until someone is brave enough to sing them again. The Carnegie moment faded from headlines. The floral tributes slowed. The views plateaued. But the story didn't end, because something curious began to happen. Letters arrived. Not emails, letters. Written by hand, folded neatly stamped in ink. One from a young soldier in Nevada. My father loved opera. He died last year. We never got to sing together. But your voice felt like a final duet. Another from a nurse in Michigan. I play recordings for my patients in hospice. Most don't respond. But when I played your aria, one of them cried. Thank you. And one from a boy, age 11. I didn't know people could sing like that. I want to learn. Samuel read every letter, then placed them in a shoebox beside his piano. Not for display, for safekeeping. Then came a different envelope. Not handwritten, no return address, just a gold-embossed crest. Inside, an invitation to speak at a conservatory, to mentor, to tell the next generation what voice really means. He almost laughed. He hadn't taught in decades, but he didn't decline. He wrote back 3 words, I will come. A month later, he walked into a room full of students. Bright eyes, restless feet, arrogant, hopeful, unsure. They were expecting a story about fame, about stages and critics and careers, but he spoke only of her, of Miriam, of walking away, of loving someone more than the echo of applause. He said, don't just sing notes, sing something you die to remember. Sing for someone who'll never hear it. No one took notes. They just listened. And that night, 2 of them stayed behind. Asked if he would listen to them sing. He did. He offered no critique, just closed his eyes. And when they were done, he whispered, she would have liked that. And in that room his legacy shifted, from a painting to a promise. From one voice to many. Years passed. Quietly, the buzz faded. The headlines vanished. The world moved on, but Samuel remained, not as a star, not as a legend, as a man, with a kettle, with a piano, with a memory. Every year on the same day, he walked to the park. Same bench, same hour. Carrying a folded blanket, a thermos of tea, and a small sheet of music. The aria, the unfinished one. No one knew why. No cameras followed him. But sometimes when the breeze was still, he would sing. Just softly, to the trees, to the sky, to her. One autumn he didn't show. The next day neighbors knocked. He didn't answer. They let themselves in. They found him by the window. Peaceful. Upright. A warm cup beside him. And a single page of music on the piano. Finished. No signature, no title. Just the final line in ink. She heard it. At the funeral, there was no marble, no gold inscription, just a wooden box, and a seat left empty in the front row. But when the first note of Nessun Dorma rose from the small quartet, something passed through the air. A hush, a warmth, a presence, as if he were still in the wings, listening, smiling. And the soprano who sang, she paused before the final note, looked toward the sky, and whispered, for Samuel, then sang not with perfection, but with devotion. And when she finished, the wind picked up. carrying the final word, Vincero, far beyond the walls. Somewhere, someone heard it, someone remembered, and in that he lived on. Not as a tenor, not as a portrait, but as a voice that chose love, and proved you don't have to stay on stage to leave something that echoes forever. If this story moved you, take a moment, not for applause, but for the quiet voices we forget. Sometimes the greatest performances happen offstage in hospital rooms, in silent sacrifices, in songs no one hears but one. Subscribe if you believe love lasts longer than fame, and some voices never truly fade.